Easter Sunday, the resurrection of Jesus, pagan holiday, Jewish tradition. People are always trying to understand what's going on here, and Christians within the Christian church argue, don't celebrate the Easter bunny and the egg. You need to celebrate Jesus. That's pagan, and there's always a dispute going on. Today, Robert and Price, Dr. Price, will be taking us into Easter and its connections to the New Testament, possibly Old Testament, dying and rising God parallels. What does Easter really mean? Why did the church make that a holiday as well? You guys are going to want to check this out. I hope you enjoy the show. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. Don't forget to comment down below your thoughts about what Easter means to you, or where there might be something we're missing when it comes to Easter. Let us know. And if you want to become a Patreon member and join Myth Vision, that's down in the description as well. We are Myth Vision. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be talking about the topic of Easter. That's right. Eggs and bunny rabbits. That's what it's all about. How you doing, Dr. Bob?
Oh, doing well. Looking forward to my chocolate bunny coming right up.
I know, because that's the whole point of the whole thing is we still do that today. Bunnies, and my kids run around the yard looking for change-filled fake eggs, and sometimes there's dollar bills in it. You know, we have we celebrate the pagan holiday. Yes, we do. It's fun. The one thing we don't do anymore is go down to church on Sunday. Personally, nothing derogatory here, but we don't go down to the church on Sunday and think that a Jewish man in the first century who literally was crucified, who literally died, who literally rose again, ever happened. We have fun with the cartoon idea of the bunny rabbit and the eggs and stuff like that. And really, it's not a cartoon. We imagine it that way. I suspect the ancients who had these traditions didn't view them like cartoons necessarily. They probably saw the reality of the bunnies and the reality of eggs and things and have significance. But I guess we can get right into the deep end. Christians will say, yeah, we agree. Bunny, rabbit, egg, that's pagan. Totally. I mean, that's obviously not Judeo-Christian worldview stuff. And the Catholic Church did all that. So don't act like Jesus is a pagan or some type of, I guess you'd say, Easter celebration type thing as the bunny and the egg, which, from my understanding, it's a symbolic of rebirth. And Jesus is not like that. Well, do you have any issues with that statement?
Well, there is a kind of a tenuous link in that, especially in Romans, it says that the whole creation groans, anticipating the glorious liberation of the sons of God. And it seems to be saying that when Christ comes again, the Adamic curse on nature will be lifted. And though I'm not sure if that is a correct reading of Genesis, it wasn't that now plants would have thorns and all that stuff. It was rather that there was a discrete place, Eden, that was the pleasure garden of the gods, and that the man and the woman were kicked out of it into the regular old world, which is difficult to farm and cultivate and all that. But nonetheless, in Romans, it does take the idea that the fall of man implicated the earth, and that's why it's so difficult to live in some ways, and that will change. And then in Revelation, you have the new heavens and the new earth. So it's not like the resurrection of Jesus has nothing to do with the idea of regeneration. Like Jesus says in Matthew, in the regeneration, the new world, you'll sit on 12 thrones judging the tribes of Israel. So there's a kind of continuity, but it is pretty loose. It does seem to me that it's just that people couldn't kick the idea that with the seasonal dying and rising gods, it had everything to do with the renewal of nature, as it did in ancient Israel with the royal ideology that that nature was running out of gas because of the sins of the people, and that the king, the son, the anointed son of God, would emulate, dramatize the death of the king of the gods and his resurrection, Marduk, Yahweh, Baal, whatever, and that would bring about the spring. And so people see, well, a case in point, there's this great story from anthropologists and classicists, investigations of primitive survivals in the modern world. And this guy was in rural Greece on Good Friday, and they were having a passion play, and the guy dressed up as Jesus is mock crucified and then carried into some enclosures representing the tomb. And the guy's watching this respectfully, and this little old lady next to him starts weeping, and he says, "Ma'am, what's the matter?" And she says, "If Christ doesn't rise on Sunday, we'll have no crops this year." Well, she understood the ancient connection, and that this was this ritual, like all the ancient rituals, was meant to facilitate the change of seasons, not simply to celebrate it. So I think the whole Easter thing, the double fertility thing, rabbits and eggs, is a survival of that too. Plus, the eggs probably represent the world egg in ancient mythology, and so it goes very deep. Just like Christmas with Santa Claus, he very likely represents the elder Dionysus, who wore red robes and had a long white beard and brought gifts into the village and so forth. So these things don't die out. It's like voodoo, which has this veneer of Catholicism, but the saints are really the Loas of Afro-Caribbean paganism, if you want to say it. They didn't chuck it; they just disguised it or assimilated it. Why not? So there are these subterranean connections, but I can see. But when Christians say that, oh, that stuff is pagan, they're sort of right too. It's just that it evolves.
It's interesting, Dr. Bob, to me. We wouldn't have the problems I feel today if open-minded ideas of where some of these things come from were accepted, and just these come from older myths. We've perfected them, or there were wonderful things about some of the things we've discovered along the way, and we've utilized them into our own traditions. We believe our traditions are sacred, and we enjoy them more than maybe yours. Those are yours. That's fine. We have ours. Instead, the handlers of these books and these writings are the ones I think that have created the dilemma for us today. So I don't want to rabbit trail into that, but I've heard you say before, you're not anti these thoughts, these books, the religion itself, and I'm not either necessarily. I think fundamentalism can be very harmful, though, coming from one that was very fundamentalist, and what it did in my mindset and the way that I was taught to view the world around me, using this text as a shield and a sword, literally, like not literally, but it was my weapon. And I would debate everyone who was wrong but me, all these things, very narrow, very close-minded mindset. And I think that's a poisonous mindset to have. I want to follow up the question that I asked before about Easter and the bunny. And yeah, you brought up exactly where I was hoping, going into agricultural aspects, which I wish during your debate with William Lane Craig, I always wish I could turn back the clock and go, Dr. Bob, I wish you'd have pinned him down on this, but you were trying to cover so much and there was no way you'd been able to. He tried to make the accusation during your debate. And he said, the problem is they have debunked this in the 1900s. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean mythicism's debunked, but he claims that the dying and rising God theme it was debunked in the 19th century, I believe he said, by scholars, whatever. Of course, that's his position. But regardless, he was making the point that the dying and rising God theme is an agricultural one, and that the New Testament Jesus is not that. So I want to pause for a second without answering that question in particular in the New Testament. I think we'll have a really good approach here. When we look at mimetic criticism, and we see how the Old Testament developed Jesus, so to speak, even if there was a guy, even if there were historical possible elements, if there was, and mimetic criticism we can all agree is there, is the Old Testament Passover, Yom Kippur, and other things, do they have connection to the Easter celebration from the pagan world?
Yeah, for instance, the like the Last Supper, for instance, though the Gospels associated with Passover, it's interesting that you have to read the Gospels, especially the Synoptic Gospels, as a chain of pericopai, these self-contained little units that make sense on their own without any context, though they have been strung together in the Gospels and sometimes in different orders, because the evangelists understood the order was negotiable. It really didn't matter in most cases. Mark and Matthew, in their Last Supper scenes, do not have Jesus say it's a Passover meal, and it doesn't look like one. There are no references to the bitter herbs and the series of cups and so forth, no lamb, etc. Now, it could be that they were just saying, well, my readers will know what this is, but Jesus doesn't say that it's a Passover meal. And I know earlier, this is where do you want us to prepare the Passover meal for you? But that's really a different story. It's like a miraculous provision story, like the upper room. Have you made arrangements? Well, no, but God has. The person you see carrying the water, he's the one to ask, and he'll show you the room, as if he had already made, maybe Jesus was online on his phone and made the connections. But once they're there, it doesn't sound like a Passover. Luke realized that, so he has Jesus say, I've looked forward to eating this Passover with you. But the rest of it still does not sound like a Passover, which kind of makes me think it wasn't supposed to be in the original. John wants to make Jesus' death that of the Passover lamb, so he has the Last Supper happen the day before Passover. So that will mean Jesus is crucified the next day, the day the Passover lamb is slain. So that's all theological, though it results in it not being a Passover feast. Well, doesn't look like it anyway. What Jesus says in the various versions of it, this bread is my body, broken for you. All of you partake of it, and this wine is my blood, shed on your behalf for the new covenant. I won't drink the fruit of the vine again until I drink it new with you in the kingdom of God, once the millennium and all that. Well, what does that have to do with Passover? We hear people say, oh yeah, this was Jesus' reinterpretation of the Passover. Now, that's not a stupid theory. Passover itself was a reinterpretation of an earlier shepherd's feast, and so forth. So there is such a thing as reinterpretations within the Bible, but it seems to me that there's a huge problem hanging out there, and that the notion of drinking blood, though of course it's symbolic, still that's just loathsome in Judaism. It's just really hard to imagine that Jews could do it, or that it would be, if they did it, that it would be interpreted as having something to do with the Passover. Now I realize there's the blood of the lamb and all that, but doesn't say that. And then eating human flesh, that's even symbolically. Now, where do you find that? Well, you find exactly that in the worship of Dionysus and Osiris and so forth, because they're gods of grain and wine and so forth. That's why Osiris is slain by his brother Set, who symbolizes the desert. And so he kills the fertility. But to commemorate the death and resurrection of Osiris, and this was all over the Mediterranean world. It was Egyptian, but spread out like crazy. The sacrament was to eat bread, symbolizing the body of the grain god, because whose body is the bread. Well, it's the body of the grain. Similarly, they would drink beer or wine, because again, beer is the grain and the blood of the grain, and wine, the blood of the grape. And the same thing with Dionysus, which is why he was also raised from the dead, a different story, but the same outcome. And the ancients figured, I bet you Dionysus and Osiris are just two names for the same god. They had equivalents of all the different gods. And there were some Jews and many Gentiles who believed that Jehovah was another version of Dionysus, interestingly. And the whole Sabazius religion of Asia Minor is based on that. So Sabaoth and Sabazius and so forth. So that's what the Last Supper, the words of institution, resemble. I mean, that's just the same thing. And contra Craig, that implies somebody was viewing Jesus as an agricultural deity. And because like they were the ones who died and rose, like Baal and so forth. So there is a connection there. And the Passover thing, I think, represents a Judaization of it, as people that were more into something like Pharisaic, which became rabbinic Judaism, as Christians who were into that felt more comfortable understanding it that way. They Judaized it, just like Matthew makes it clearer than anybody else that Jesus believed in the perpetuity of the Torah, that it would, as long as the world lasted, the Torah would, and therefore you had to keep the least commandment. That's clearly a Matthean creation, and so he is Judaizing it. He cuts what Mark 7 says about Jesus declaring all foods clean, because he didn't think he did. He didn't buy that, and so forth. This is part of what I'm looking at with the book I'm working on now, Judaizing Jesus. And it seems to me that that's clearly what happened. So the connection with paganism and agricultural religion seems to me much more clear than any connection with Passover. Though again, the evangelists are already trying to do that, just by implication from the context, the narrative context in Mark and Matthew, and then explicitly in Luke's redaction. It's part of the, I would say the historicizing of Jesus was also the Judaizing of Jesus, that the idea of Jesus as the celestial being was more of a Pauline, Marcionite kind of a thing. And once they decided they wanted to have a human historical Jesus, that's why all the stories about him are drawn from the Old Testament. And the Marcionites didn't do that. And that's because they didn't believe in that kind of Jesus.
It's interesting. I'm reading the Dionysian Gospel by Dennis R. MacDonald. And some points are stronger than others, of course. Other points maybe not as strong for the parallels, even though they may be the case. You kind of have to work with what you have. That's kind of the thing. Is could it be a parallel? Yeah. Are we? We try to prove it as much as possible that there's a connection. without trying to hallucinate one there.
Mm.
But nonetheless, it could still have a connection and not be paralleled the way we think, because you've brought it before that sometimes it's what doesn't parallel that makes you have to see. But what I wanted to mention, you brought up Dionysus, and Dionysus is obviously a agricultural deity who has connections into these type of things, dying and rising, rebirth, that kind of stuff. And I was reading this, and I wanted to mention the Lord's Supper, because I think that's important in the whole idea of Easter Sunday and such too. And many people want to make it as Jewish as possible. But if I had Rabbi Tovia Singer on the show, he would scream how non-Jewish this is. Are you kidding me? He would just be like, anyone who has eyes at all and can read basic words, even transliterated into their own language, can see this goes against everything the law teaches. Okay, you cannot eat flesh of humans. You cannot drink blood. But then someone will go, oh, it's only spiritual. But if you look at Dionysus, I wanted to mention the grape, and it talks about the blood of the grape. It's like really strange, language to use, but the blood of the grape and the flesh is the skin of the grape, and all this interesting language that does connect. And it makes me think of Jesus. So what is the beef with saying Jesus is another agricultural deity? Where's the contention there? And this has everything to do with Easter, because Easter is a symbol for rebirth, relife. I mean, that's when trees are now, pollinating, everything's coming back green. Where are the people who come up with this really that far off? I mean, people claim to have debunked this.
Yeah, that is utter nonsense. They just there's a, what would you call it, I can't think of the term, but there's a retrenchment and a tendency to flinch in the face of theories that are theologically uncomfortable. And enough scholars are Christians to want to stay in that comfort zone. And so it's easy for them to laugh it off. But if you look at the arguments, they seem spurious to me. And I don't think it was ever refuted, though I don't know if it was ever the majority opinion of scholars, but it's always been a strong theory, and I think it's been vindicated plenty in recent years. And so I just think and they always give you the old harumph, that nobody thinks this. Of course, they're wrong about that, but even if they were, it wouldn't make any difference. It's just blatant appeal to consensus fallacy or appeal to authority. I just am amazed every time I hear people take that approach. Don't you realize how scholarship in any field proceeds and develops by the succession of paradigms? Something starts off as a minority view, and then if it can prove itself, it becomes the majority view, until something else looks even better. You can't just tie yourself to one view and bet that nothing is ever going to supersede it. And it's obvious from the way Craig and others argue that they're just trying to protect their theological investment. They realize that if you admitted that Good Friday and Easter and all that are of a piece, both with these agricultural deities and with the various divine men and exalted heroes, there are dozens of parallels to ascensions and assumptions and divinizations and post-mortem appearances to explain to disciples or followers. Why, again, like I said in my very first debate, why consider Captain Marvel and the Martian Manhunter figments of the imagination, but Superman, he must have been real? What reason? I mean, theoretically, conceivably, that's possible, but why think so? You just have a vested interest you're trying to protect.
I think it's funny. I got to say something that dawned on me that I've thought about before, never really mentioned on air. Your analogy, Superman, Clark Kent. something that I had never really hook, line, and sinker took in. I use that phrase a lot, hook, line, and sinker. You talk about Clark Kent and Superman for the historical Jesus. What I find interesting is we're debating over, was there a historical Jesus? I'm agnostic on the position at this point, Dr. Bob. I was definitely hook, line, like I went mythos is hardcore. Don't get me wrong. It's not necessarily the evidence, so to speak, that's made me go agnostic. It's that at the end of the day, there really could have been. I have no way of knowing for sure at this point. But when you say that, I always think, yeah, there could have been a Clark Kent. The problem is I don't have any writings that clearly tell me here's a Clark Kent. Okay. When you talk about Superman existing, we all agree that the Christ doesn't agree. I asked historicists, does the Christ agree? Does the Christ exist? I mean, and they say no. So then I say, well, there could have been a Clark Kent, just like they have there could have been a Clark Kent that was made into a Christ. My problem is I wish we had material that wasn't a book that was about the Christ. If we didn't have nothing but Christ material, if we had a few little, here's Clark Kent material or anything, it doesn't have to be like he ate this on Tuesday. I met him. He was a great teacher like you've mentioned before. Even if it was writing similar to like what we do find with other figures like Caesar, Caesar's writings aren't always by his people, always Christological and superimposed and exaggerated. No, that's all I have with Jesus. So I'm fair to say, hey, there could have been, but I'm agnostic on whether there was. That was a rabbit trail. And I didn't mean to go too far, but did you want to comment on that?
Well, that's really no different from the idea of the resurrection. Is there any real evidence for that? And and that boils down to, do we have anything that is likely to be an eyewitness record of that? And because people always say, well, the apostles weren't lying, what would motivate that, and so forth. Look, the gospel accounts do not read like eyewitness accounts. They have obvious theological motivations. They have pagan parallels with the holy women seeking the body of the slain Savior, like Attis and Tammuz and Baal and so forth. And and one edits the other. The differences between them are not like varying witnesses to a car accident, as people always say. Though it's interesting, they're sort of willing to sacrifice the inerrancy of the Bible in order to defend the resurrection. It's like retreating to the inner castle when the invaders are coming. But it doesn't sound like that. You can easily explain why the differences are literary in nature. Like, why in Mark is there no resurrection appearance? Well, that's probably just the statement that the tomb was empty and he will go before you in Galilee. That must have been enough for Mark. But Matthew and Luke, writing later, thought that, gee, that isn't good enough. We got to tell about that meeting. And then Luke changes what the angel says. So he doesn't say go to Galilee. He says, remember how when he was in Galilee, he told you we would rise. That's not just mishearings. Something that is changing the story because you want to have a Jerusalem-centered narrative, which we do have in Luke 24 and in Acts. So Jesus appears in and around Jerusalem. In Matthew, the women see first Mark's young man at the tomb, but Matthew makes him an angel. Now, he might have been intended that way in Mark. That's a good reading of it, but you can't really tell. And he says half of what the young man of Mark said, but the other half is taken up by Jesus himself, who appears to the women. How did Mark miss that? How did Luke miss that? Luke said that the women didn't see him. And they only report of the disciples, which Mark said they didn't, the empty tomb. What's going on here? Well, it's pretty obvious to me. Matthew had the same ambiguity about who was Mark's young man. Was it an angel? They're often described as young men. Or was it the risen Jesus? And so, just to cover all the bets, he splits the character into two and divides the young man's statement in Mark between his angel and his risen Jesus. Then what does Luke do? Well, he doesn't have the benefit of reading Matthew, in my opinion. And so he just had Mark, but he too found it inadequate. So he has Jesus then appear he has two angels, interestingly, two men in the tomb, because he's also going to have two of them at the ascension. I don't know why. Testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses from the Old Testament, I don't know, but then he gives them the Great Commission and appears to the guys on the road to Emmaus and so forth. A story that so closely parallels an Asclepius story that I have to think it was likely based on it. And then later copyists of Mark decided, yeah, this is too abrupt an ending. Let's add some stuff. John does the same thing, only his is totally different. He didn't bother with what Matthew or Luke said, but added his own conclusion. This stuff is not eyewitness testimony. You could posit that, well, maybe it goes back to eyewitness testimony, but I don't think so. If Luke thought the women didn't see Jesus and Matthew thought they did, that's not a minor inconsistency. Or if Mark says the young man told him to tell the disciples what he told them, but Luke, John, and Matthew all blatantly contradict it and say, oh no, they did go and tell. Now that alone tells you that the other 3 evangelists rejected Mark's ending and came up with new endings. That means they have to be fiction. And so this does not sound like eyewitness testimony. If you look at the 1 Corinthians 15 list, I've written at length on this, that I think the whole thing is an interpolation, one of many, into 1 Corinthians, and that Harnack was right. It was a composite of several resurrection kerygmas. That's why there's the redundancy between he appeared to Peter and the 12 and to James and all the apostles. Aren't those the same thing? Yeah, and Harnack said this is because 2 competing Jewish Christian sects had the announcement that their chief and the disciples got resurrection visions. I mean, right there, that contradiction, it just means it's worthless as evidence. And then when you get to the 500 brethren, that appears to be a still later interpolation based on the Acts of Pilate. And what evidence we have, of course, is fragmentary and open to interpretation, but that's just the problem. You cannot brag that it's eyewitness testimony of a resurrection. And then you got to Matthew with the Night of the Living Dead story and the paid off guards. Why did no one else mention this? If Jesus appeared to 500 people together, Mark, the others didn't think that was worth mentioning, where they're running out of ink? It's just absurd. And so you have to ask, why were these stories told? And often they seem to have functioned as credential stories, like in 1 Corinthians 9:1. Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? That implies you had to be able to claim a resurrection appearance to count as an apostle, and whether you actually did or not, who knows? So it's just absurd to hear people who have a wealth of scholarly training, as William Lane Craig and others do, to suddenly slam on the brakes and just return to Sunday school.
It sounds like, and look, it's human nature. I get it. I'll put it like this. If I used to be, when I was Christian, right, I'd listen to atheists like you. And this is not a joke. I would come in my mind was set on, I'm going to go to school. I'm going to educate myself to be able to take these guys out and to try and disprove them. My motives were, I'm going to wrap my head around the same information and find a way to be right. You see what I mean? So confirmation bias or cognitive dissonance played a huge role in my approach. My motivating factor was to prove the faith right. Regardless, it had to be true. And my faith superseded any type of intellectual or evidential based stuff. It had to line up with my faith because subjectively I knew it was true. Kind of like when you listen to some of these other guys, not just William Lane Craig. I can't even remember the name of the other Christian apologist that I was wanting to use. Michael Licona. You know, he had times of doubt in his faith when he started getting into some of this research, because I'm sure some of this evidence was heavy. At the end of the day, I can guarantee you what happened wasn't necessarily the evidence was really that great. There's an emotional confirmation bias there that he needed to have that comfort. There's something comforting about being faith. And then there's also, if you're already in a path and that there's a lot of stuff backing, you have a reason not to let go. For example, if I was a YouTube channel, let's just say Christianity was true, and I ended up 250,000 subscribers deep on this channel. A lot of skeptics, a lot of heretics, a lot of people who enjoy this stuff. Some are God haters, some are chill, some aren't God haters. And they're like, you know what? Listen, I'm just into the information. I don't believe there's a God, but I'm not a hater of it. Whatever. And at the end of the day, I become a Christian, or I want to, or I think it's true or something. There's a good chance I'm not going to, because I have reasons, external reasons, that are going to influence me to not change my mind. Now, I had to do that as a Christian. I was going to college. I got excommunicated from the church. My whole family went through some crap. I had no reason to let go of what I was believing because I was finding out different evidences, but I did it. And not many people can do that. But Dr. Bob, I'm sorry to rabbit trail there. I just wanted I wanted to ask you another
Bunny rabbit. I mean, Easter rabbits. Come on, that's right on topic.
I didn't mean to say that too. A rabbit trail. You going
Here comes Peter Cottontail. Oh, sorry.
The dying and rising God motif and agricultural myth. Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. I see a lot of parables that hint at the wheat, the chaff. There's a lot of weird agricultural pictures in these parables that he gives, from the vineyard to, the harvest coming. All these things, do they play a significant role in the dying, rising God motif, or am I going off into fantasy land?
I don't think that's really decisive because that was so common. In fact, there are errors in the Gospels, in the parables even, about farming and shepherding that imply to me that whoever wrote this was not that familiar with the Galilean or Palestinian context, that otherwise they would have known that a shepherd who was missing one sheep would not leave 99 to the mercy of roaming wolves and bears to go find the one. It just didn't occur to him. It could just be a bad parable, but it's so outrageous. You want, like, the teller didn't seem to think there was anything wrong with it. And from what I've read, the way planting seeds in the parable of the sower does not match the methods used in Palestinian agriculture and so forth. And you'd think somebody would know that, but when it's correct, it doesn't necessarily mean that the teller of the story even knew much about the environment and so on. Let me give an example of something, a Dionysus parallel that, however, is equivocal. When John the Baptist says that the coming one will separate the wheat from the chaff, his winnowing fan is in his hand. Well, Dionysus was depicted holding a winnowing fan to separate and all that. But that was so common. The mere presence of it doesn't really prove it. I'm sure MacDonald must mention this, the true vine discourse. I am the vine, you are the branches. Boy, that really does sound Dionysian. But on the other hand, viniculture was quite well known. You don't have to be referring to Dionysus for that to be a natural illustration. So some of that stuff, it doesn't have the power that the Last Supper business, this is my body, this is my blood, that sticks out from the supposed context. So you got to wonder, where did it come from? Oh, right here. But some of these things, like you said, with MacDonald's comparisons, some of them are not decisive, nor does he pretend they are, because what he's trying to do is to say, if we can establish that there are whopping parallels between Mark and Homer, like the Gerasene demoniac story. I mean, come on, there's no way that's not from the Odyssey. Then you begin to look at other aspects. Well, what about the messianic secret? Could that stem from Odysseus trying to keep his identity secret for a while? I bet it does. And then there's the two feedings of the 4 and the 5,000. I don't find that decisive, though he could be right. He's just saying, if you can establish the basic thing, what light would that shed on other stuff that in itself is not decisive but compatible? And that's the whole paradigm thing. You wouldn't start with the minor ones. But the major ones are like that. And I'm sure he does the same thing with the Dionysus thing, though I don't have the book. I've not read it.
I'm working on it. I'm chipping away. I'm like 60 pages in, just started.
Yeah, he is great.
Oh, he is. He is. I'm going to have him back on. We're going to talk about this one too. Maybe I was going to say at some point I'd like to get you and him together. I don't know if you've done a show with Dennis MacDonald.
No, never. I've corresponded with him and read some of his books. I think very highly of him.
I think we'd have a great collaboration on our hands down the road where we can have you and him together. And something interesting, I heard a Jew. He's a scholar, of course, from Yale. There was an interesting presentation done by Christine Hayes that was talking about the Goyim and the Goy, and just going into the nations and who were the nations, who were the Gentiles and such in Israel. And they were talking about how Paul used grafting in concepts of wild olive branches to the original olive branches that are cultured, if you will. And the Jew goes, first of all, I just need to give you guys real agricultural some real truth about this. If you ever graft in a wild branch into an actual cultivated one, he said, the whole thing will stop producing fruit.
Huh.
And she's like, what do you mean? Like, he's like, you listen, it's chaos. It's ridiculous to really graft in a wild olive branch to a cultivated one. It'll stop producing olives. You'll never have any fruit that comes from it, which is kind of interesting, because I guess if you're really a Jew who's actually cultivating olives and this analogy comes up by Paul, you could probably go, red flag, dude. At that point, you're saying you don't even need to produce any fruit. So he doesn't even need to produce any fruit at this point, but just saying,
it's more likely he just didn't know what he was talking about,
right?
Because he had no, if there was a historical, Paul, whoever wrote it, just wasn't into that stuff. Though there's been a controversy for a long time over whether Paul got it right. Some commentators say, oh no, whoever wrote this didn't understand it. And others say, oh no, I'm afraid he did. And I'm in no position to say. C.H. Dodd talks about that and others. So I don't know who to believe on that one.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never grafted in a wild olive branch.
And I hope never to do it.
I know, right? So the egg and the bunny, what does that play? I mean, is that completely foreign from anything biblical in those sense? Or what does the bunny represent? If there's any connection to the bunny in Easter and the New Testament or Old Testament, is there anywhere that it has its connections? And if so, how?
Yeah, I don't think so, because it has to do with life renewing itself, but it's more specific than that. It has to do with fertility, which I think was not really a concern of the New Testament writers. And especially since you've got Paul saying, I wish everybody were single like me. St. Augustine said that the sex drive was a result of the fall. And if not for that, we would still have procreated, but it wouldn't have been any fun. So somebody said, or I guess he raised the possibility, well, if people didn't procreate, the human race would come to an end, wouldn't it? And Augustine said, well, so what of it? I'm hoping for the second coming of Christ. Who needs new generations?
It's easy for someone like him to say that after all the orgies he had prior to getting converted. He's had his fun. That's not fair.
That's right. Yeah.
No, that's funny. That whole idea you brought up before about the fall being of a sexual, something sexual is taking place there because she's now with the curse of giving birth in pain. And then here you have virgins being saved in the later version, or in Revelation, if you will, which is kind of odd. Be fruitful, multiply. Is that really Torah? I mean, here we go again with an interesting, it's not quite the elbow as human sacrifice and eating of the flesh and blood, but going away from be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth, or even, trying to produce sons of God through birth, because that's how it was. Their whole goal was keep producing offspring and keep growing the kingdom. That was the way to grow the kingdom. And the New Testament does an entirely different thing. Eunuchs are now able to produce sons of God. I mean, how in the world can you have someone who they have nothing to reproduce? I got to be careful what I say for YouTube, but they can't reproduce and they're sons of God. And in the Old Testament, if I'm not mistaken, or Hebrew Bible, there are clear implications. You can't be a priest. You can't work in the inner courts. You got to stay on the outer courts. If anything's defiled down there, or, you have a imperfection or something's wrong, the New Testament does something that seems opposite of Torah. Wouldn't you agree? Or?
Well, I think it does conflict with the priestly creation account, be fruitful and multiply, but it is, I think the Gnostics, who were Encratites too, the celibacy gospel, they correctly interpreted the Eden story, where the knowledge that God doesn't want them to have is the knowledge of procreation. And he makes the woman simply as a companion. There's this note that says, well, this is why a man leaves his father's house and cleaves to his wife, and the two become one flesh. But he's sort of letting you know where this is going. But that is not said to be the intent of the Creator. And once the serpent tells him about the knowledge of all things, that's when that seems to be carnal knowledge, especially in light of the Gilgamesh parallel. After the priesthood initiates Enkidu, who's an Adam-like figure, into sexuality, his old friends, the animals, flee from him in panic. And he said, what the heck? What happened? And the woman says to him, behold, Enkidu, you are wise like unto a god. And it was sexual knowledge that was going on there. Well, that has to be what the serpent told them. And God can't undo it. And he says, oh my gosh, they've eaten of the fruit of knowledge. Their eyes are open. They become like us. We got to get them out of here, lest they eat of the tree of life and live forever. Because if they do, they'll be competing gods, and there'll be no end of them. They'll reproduce, and you'll have a world full of gods. What does that do to us? We'll be the minority. The Gnostics, I think, completely understood the story taken literally. But of course, people cannot brook that today. God lied, and God was threatened by them. Yeah, we're not talking about Thomas Aquinas or Saint Anselm here. These guys were philosophers, and these people were myth spinners. And so, yeah, the celibacy thing is really participating in that kind of asceticism. You didn't have to be a full-bore Gnostic to go with it. There were various Encratites who at least preferred celibacy as the higher way, like the Dead Sea Scrolls people, Essenes or whatever. We know there were married ones, but the elite were celibate. And on into the 3rd century, you had Manichaeans and Marcionites and others who were Encratites, from enkrateo, self-control, meaning continence and celibacy. So yeah, that was a different thing based on Gnosticism. But then again, how much of Gnosticism is based on Judaism? Why did they bother bringing up the Garden of Eden and Seth and Abel and all that unless they were some kind of Jews, just considered heretics later?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be shocked. I mean, what I've recently been digging into, if Jews were reading pagan sources, and I'm not just talking about for Hellenization tools to learn Greek, but a lot of them were influenced by it. I wouldn't be shocked if the same is vice versa. Could a non-Jew be interested in the stories of the Old Testament or the
Oh
Hebrew?
yeah,
So,
we know, like what's his name, Berosus and Manetho wrote about the stories of Genesis and Exodus, and they seem to have gone to the same sources the Pentateuchal writers went to, but there was certainly knowledge of Judaism. I mean, how come we have the Septuagint at all, the Greek translation? Well, we're told that I think it was Ptolemy the Third, the Hellenistic king of Egypt. He wanted to have all the great books in his library, so he commissioned Jews to translate it. And there were the God-fearers all over the Mediterranean who were Gentiles who knew enough about Judaism to really like it, but they didn't want to go the whole way and be circumcised and swear off of ham sandwiches and so on. And
yeah.
can we still come to the synagogue and hear the scripture? Yeah, sure, come on in. But you can't go into the temple, I'm afraid. But who needs it? They didn't want to sacrifice anyway.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I got to do more research on the God-fearers because I've been reading a book right now about it. It's a little biased. It's from a Messianic Christian, but some of the information's pretty interesting. However, he's trying to I think push a particular view when it comes to Christianity, but some of the information I've never heard, which is a little educational. Dr. Bob, back on Easter. I guess with that being said, is there anything else you can think of that's unique about this holiday that's overlooked by many people, Christian, non-Christian alike, that the Jesus story plays a part in some way? Can you think of something?
Well, there's the existential aspect of it, which fits with baptism whenever you do it, though they used to way back wait to baptize people on Easter because it's a ritual reenactment of the death and resurrection of Jesus, which joined you to it and enabled you to participate in it since you were becoming part of the body of Christ. That was a common mystery religion notion. Anybody initiated into the religion of Mithras participated in Mithras' slaying of the cosmic bull, which renewed everything. Those who were Hercules initiates would put on a lion mane during the initiation because Hercules did when he killed the Nemean lion. And there were other things like that where you would participate, you would patch yourself in to the salvation epic. And you would, like, there might be preparation before you could be initiated into the Mithraic rites. You had to undergo a strict process of moral discipline and self-reform, which is kind of like the pre-baptismal catechism and so on. And so that this would mean a real change in your life and behavior. And Christians, of course, would say it's because I've received the Spirit of Christ in the water of baptism, a la John chapter 3, born again of water and the Spirit, and so on. Well, that is, I think, the chief significance seen by believers in Easter and baptism, now that they're not, both of them, now that they're not united anymore. And so you expect, it's an occasion to be mindful of the new life in Christ you're supposed to be living. I guess you'd recommit yourself and say, well, I'm not alone in this. I do have the power of the risen Christ, and I'll do better. I think that's the major thing why anybody celebrates it at all, because modern people don't think that the crops and the harvest are dependent on Easter, though they're, in a sense, the bunny and the eggs and all that do kind of imply that. It's like a remnant, a vestige of that, but that's not on their mind. It's kind of compartmentalized.
I guess I got another little funny question that gets into the nitpickies we like to look at theologically and textually. Take up your cross and follow me, right? We know that shouldn't be there by the author's omniscience of things that, if this is literally talking about taking up your cross and following me. My issue is wrestling with theological concepts. I constantly wrestle back and forth with, could this be a real historical guy? I mean, yeah, Romans crucified Jews all the time. What's so special? I mean, what's so hard for you to accept, Dr. Bob? It's duh. Crucified Jesus is on a cross right here. The Romans did it all the time. Why is that so hard for you to accept for people? What gets me, and I just throw that out there, is how theological this is. See, it's not that it couldn't be. You don't knock the chance of it possibly being the case. It's so theological, it's hard for me to see, unless you go to the Gospels, which to me, I just wrote this down earlier, I called them the Jesus epics, because that's really what they are. They're epics. They're stories. That's pretty much the way I look at them, like you would look at the story of Homer, writing on Odysseus, etc. Could there be historical elements there? Yes, absolutely. We're not discounting that. But I have a problem. If Jesus was crucified like any other insurrection leader, and this is leaving the Easter for a second, but I got you on the show, so I might as well ask. I mentioned this in the last episode I did, was Jesus was lifted up in the wilderness, just as the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness. And in order to get into the promised land through Jesus, the serpent had to bite you, the land flowing milk and honey, et cetera, et cetera. You had to be struck by the curse is being lifted up, et cetera. You had to be struck, whatever, to pass through to get to the promised land. You had to pass through Christ, if you will, so to speak, to get to the promised land. How can you find the meat? There's so much fat here. I'm trying to find the meat to find the guy. And I know you can respect this. You haven't made your mind up and you just have it. No, you're open to the discovery of the historical possible Jesus, even though you have another explanation that you believe best fits this scenario. And the take up your cross, follow me concept, and take up your cross and follow me. Was he really saying, hey, dude, go be crucified like me? Is that what he's trying to imply in the epic here? Or what do you think is going on?
Well, I think it means the same thing as it does in First Peter, where it says that Christ suffered and you are called to follow in his footsteps. He doesn't mention crucifixion specifically, but of course that's what he's talking about. And so you've got to be ready for persecution. Oddly enough, this was apparently First Peter was originally a baptismal sermon talking about identifying with Christ and so on. I think that if you think Jesus was saying, there's a terrible risk here. If you follow me, you're liable to come to the same bad end I have. crucifixion, like zealots get. But this doesn't make any sense unless Jesus was a zealot like Eisler and Brandon say. And now, if you think there's reason to accept that, and you can make a pretty strong case for it, it could have meant that. But even so, that's not like, well, it demands that everybody knew Jesus was a revolutionary, and but then if that's not the case, and it's just equivalent to the First Peter text, you've got to ask yourself, since it makes manifest and complete sense in that First Peter church kind of context, what reason is there to come up with a more contrived, implausible, but possible explanation? That's like Occam's razor. Wouldn't that be superfluous? The simplest explanation seems to be that this is a Christian exhortation for people to follow the crucified Christ, and that means that it can't be an authentic saying of a historical Jesus, because even his own disciples are depicted as not knowing he would get crucified, and so he's telling this to the crowd. But what's he talking about? I mean, he admits that he confused the crowds with parables, and that was kind of the whole idea, that you had to dig for it, like the apocalyptic text. Let him who has wisdom figure this out. But a statement like that, it just seems to me to demand that this is like a prophecy of the ascended Christ, or a fabricated saying, or whatever, just like the First Peter thing is. I mean, it might have some other reference, but the price tag on that is to imagine Jesus as a publicly known revolutionary. And that's a whole different story.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I don't want to take this into a different, we got to do a topic related show on this, because questions of probability, like, I like to ask, I had Camille on, and people think this is just a mythicist program. It's not. And as much as you are a mythicist, it's not a mythicist only. No, we are entertaining all ideas. I'm looking for the guy. Trust me when I say I'm looking for the guy. Lane Einhorn had some great stuff to mention about the
Oh,
Egyptian.
yeah, she's amazing.
She's good. She's looking at these epics, though, and she's trying to find there's roots here, right? And then there's others who say, no, it couldn't be the Egyptian. It's got to be this, or it might be Judas the Galilean, or it might be Jesus ben Ananias, or it could be this guy or this guy. I'm looking for him, I promise you. And one of the questions I was thinking was, is it more probable that it was based on a guy who was actually crucified, since crucifixion was common, which I hear that often, or you're saying a heavenly crucifixion? Well, there's copies above and below, you guys will say. But there are people who are like, show me in the New Testament that shows these things and stuff. So maybe we can do a show where you can explain your perception. I mean, I'm very torn between on many of these things, and why I don't just buy into what people say. I want to test it out and look into it. But if anybody is wondering what Easter's all about, honestly, bunnies and chocolate. That's pretty much it. I'm just kidding. I'm just teasing. So that the whole Resurrection Sunday thing, I wanted to ask one more, because it's about resurrection. The 3 days and 3 nights concept. Is this Easter related? And why did it only happen to be a day and a half in the Gospels? What's going on with this?
Yeah, that is really fascinating. For one thing, you notice how nobody in the Gospels sees Jesus rise. Nobody ever even claims that. In the Gospel of Peter, they do, but it never says in the other Gospels, which means it's a big open question as to after how many days did Jesus rise. We usually just say, well, it was, we count it as of the day they discovered the empty tomb, but he's already gone. It doesn't, the young man at the tomb doesn't say, you just missed him. We don't know when it was assumed he rose. And that may have something to do with the fact that you have these two different estimates, that after 3 days he rose, or on the third day he rose. That's not the same thing. And I know the harmonization, that if a second had passed of the third day, they would count it as a day. I'm not so sure that's even true, but it seems to me the best answer is that some people just borrowed the after 3 days from the Attis cult, where Attis bled to death, and then on the fourth day, after 3 days, they had the Hilarion, the day of rejoicing, which is marked the resurrection of Attis. And we know when they thought he rose, on that day, because we know how they celebrated it. On the day of his death, they would take a wooden effigy of him and tie it to a stripped pine tree trunk, and which is kind of crucifixion, like, crucified on the tree and all that. And they would take it into some sort of a cave or recess or something and start mourning. And then on the fourth day, they would bring it out of the tomb, and the priests would say, rejoice, O you of the mystery, or you initiates, for your God is saved, and we too shall be saved from ills. So I think that was widespread, and that they picked it up from there. They figured, well, similar story, maybe that's what happened. What about the on the third day? Well, that I think comes from Hosea, where and I'm far from the only one to point this out. Let's see, yeah, in Hosea, let's say 5:15 through 6:2. I will return again to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. And in their distress they seek me, saying, come, let us return to the Lord. For he has torn that he may heal us. He has stricken and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Well, that I think is the origin of the competing on the third day version. And so we happen to have a likely basis for both versions, which are not the same. And even there, who knows what the story originally intended.
It's strange, man. To me, that sounded very corporate, very Israel as a nation or as a corporate body being raised, not just an individual. Which
Yeah,
makes,
but you know how they plucked passages out and said, well, yeah, I know what it meant to them, but the Holy Spirit inserted a prophecy that could only be understood in retrospect, and this is what it was. Just like elsewhere in Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I have called my son. These people weren't idiots. They knew what it originally meant, the Exodus. They're saying, but now we see the added dimension. Jesus must have gone into Egypt and come back.
right.
Same
That's what I was
sort
going
of
to
thing.
say. I wondered if the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus was symbolic of the nation or symbolic of Israel as a whole. But that's all, man, we're going all over the place, Dr. Bob. This has been wonderful. Do you have a particular book that you've written on the subject of Easter in?
Let's see. Well, I discuss it in the Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, and in Night of the Living Savior, and of course in Holy Fable Volume 2, the Gospels and Acts Undistorted by Faith. By the way, my I guess also in the Case Against the Case for Christ. I just received copies of my new book, Reinterpreting the New Testament, and it's up on Amazon, and I got some nifty stuff in there. And I just got word this morning that they're mailing me copies of Holy Fable Volume 4. And though it's going to be, I think, a couple of weeks yet before Amazon features it, but the book is done and ought to be getting it all 700 pages of it.
Mm. I definitely look forward to that.
Plus, I should mention, if I probably have already, my fiction collection, Horrors and Heresies, which gets into all kinds of biblically related weird fiction and so on.
That's awesome. Oh, there's one more thing. The Christ conspiracy, or is it? Yeah.
That's shortly to be up on Amazon. Probably it may be already. I don't know. You'll be able to order it direct from Stellar House Publishing or from Amazon, and it's the significantly revised version of Acharya's great book. It's so ironic, and I love this, that I blistered that book in the original version. I had all kinds of severe criticisms, which Acharya took seriously, and these problems are absent from her later books. And what an honor, she requested that I revise it right before she passed away. And so and a couple other people worked on it, though they for some reason give me credit as the editor, but that ought to be out momentarily. Same title, The Christ Conspiracy, the greatest story ever sold.
So it's a total rework, technically. I mean, practically.
Well, I don't know. It's just missing a lot of the extraneous stuff, like the maps of the ancient sea kings and the Masons, and a lot of kind of weird stuff that shouldn't have been in there to begin with, and some particular points where I think she was in error. Just about fact things, but the penis-headed rooster that Bart Ehrman ridiculed her for, saying she made it up, that's real, and it's still in the book.
Look, I'm like, I've got the Audible of Heaven and Hell with Bart right now. So, like I told you, we can get you on Audible, man. There's just so many people like me. Like, I'm about to drive 4 or 5 days crossing the country. I can't read while driving. I can listen. I can't read. And there's so many truckers out there that are probably tooting the Robert M. Price horn, hoping they can listen to an audio book. So I don't know. We still got to figure that out together. Thank you.
Well, that may be illegal because there's the danger of falling asleep at the wheel if you're listening to mine.
Don't even. Nah. That doesn't happen. Maybe only if you're doing the Colossal Apostle in audio, because the problem with that is it's so meticulously it's overly scrutinizing, and so many, it's hard to. You got to have super coffee if you're going to listen to it, because it's just you really are going into some serious holes within holes that you're trying to get into. So it can be a lot of hard, strenuous thinking there. But yeah, I love what you're doing, Dr. Bob, and I'd like to do a show down the road challenging your mythicism. Okay, and not in a here's a forefront debate, nothing like that. I'm talking about getting some of the guys like Camille Gregor, getting some of the guys like Christopher Hansen, who've read a lot of mythicism, who found issues, or they might say, well, this seems more plausible to me, and get those questions to you so you can prepare to see what the questions are, so you understand what they're saying, so you're not blindsided. That's the worst thing to do, is let me try and get you. No, you want to dig in and figure your stuff out. We'll get a donation to this project, and we'll do we'll crucify Robert. I almost called you Donald Trump. Robert M. Price. We'll crucify you.
That's a great compliment.
We'll crucify you with this stuff and see how well you do in terms of the questions that are prepared. If you're interested.
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, because a lot of people will think, hey, historicity wins, and I'm back and forth. I wake up one morning. This morning I was a mythicist. Who knows what I'll be after lunch? You know what I'm saying?
That's quite proper. That's the scholarly way.
Yeah, I don't like debates. Not a big fan of it, as much as I am a fan of discussion. Now, if the debate is civil, I can respect and I can do it. This is cool. But if I want to watch Jerry Springer, I'll just turn on Jerry
Yeah.
Springer, you know?
Mm, mm.
So.
Yeah, I really don't care for debating.
Yeah, and I know it's two football teams. Who's going to win is who you're rooting for. You're not really in it to hear new concepts of information. I always thought I was siding with Christians when I was Christian. That was it. Bottom line. Now the Christian will say, yeah, but now you only side with the other side because that's what you do. I've actually heard some Christians who've brought up some interesting points when I've heard them debating or challenging others. At the end of the day, I can understand now what I could never think about when I was a Christian. So like Matt Dillahunty, when he's debating atheism or why he's a skeptic and doesn't believe, over to someone who might bring up an argument, and there's a variety of guys he's debated, I can understand where the Christian is coming from. And it's a strong argument in the mindset of a Christian. But when you've left and you realize there's a much bigger world out there and not just 66 books, then you start to go, oh, okay, I understand now what Matt's saying and why the strength of his argument is stronger now. I couldn't see beyond the scope of a book. So we have rabbit trailed the end of this Easter show quite far. I really do appreciate it. If you have anything to say to the audience, let them know right now.
Well, just following up on what you just said, my favorite part of the debates I've been in is the question and answer session at the end, because I can think of one time where somebody was hot under the collar challenging me. But on the whole, I have just been so happy to see people who I could tell were believers were sincerely curious about points I had raised, and it was really a kind of a dialogue, and that gave me a much higher estimate of the people in the audience. So I just love dealing with people's questions. But
Excellent.
with Easter, I hope people will be able to get together for church or dinner or whatever, despite the corona plague thing, and probably can if you have less than a huge crowd, from what they say. And I hope everybody has a meaningful and transformative Easter. And I no longer feel that way about it, I have to admit, but I know a lot of people do, and it's certainly a wholesome thing. So happy Easter.
My kids will be definitely looking for eggs. That's all I can say. And I'll continue to teach them to look for eggs. And as a fun celebrated holiday, not we call it holiday, holy day, whatever you want to call it, just a fun day. I really appreciate you joining me here, Dr. Bob, and I hope everyone else is safe during these times. It's hard for me to know what's really going on with so many different spins of things that are out there on the web trying to tell us this is what's going on, and different ideas. So I do, for precaution reasons, suggest people keep safe distance. Obviously, try your best to keep, it doesn't hurt to do so. But then again, a Christian would say, it wouldn't hurt for you to believe in God, because what if hell is real? Anyway, I love you guys. Thanks a lot for joining in. And thank you so much, Dr. Bob. Let's get Dr. Bob a challenge here and write your questions. Send them in, mythvisionpodcast@gmail.com. Give me some good questions, not just some surface level stuff. You know, you can't treat Dr. Bob that way. We got to crucify this guy like any other dying and rising God.
Well, speaking of that, I got to ask, when is Luther going to emerge from the tomb?
Luther, that's a great question. Someone asked me that yesterday. It's hard to get him to leave what he does. He's a hermit. He was a hermit when I met him. He's a hermit to this day. I had him proactive for a while, and he wanted to go off, do his studies, and try and work on his book. But do you want me to suggest something?
Oh, no, I'm the same way. I hunker down here and prepare to write these books and so on. I can understand it. But tell him we miss him.
I will. I've tried to get him to come back and stay busy. Obviously, I have to keep this boat afloat. And, we'll see what happens in the future. I'm sure he's going to join me on other shows at some point, but he's doing his book thing. He'd rather do what he does. And this is how I learn a lot too. So just getting new ideas flung at me keeps me open-minded. So I appreciate you, Dr. Bob, and anyone who's wondering, if you haven't figured it out by now, we are Myth Vision.